you very much, Lord Stern, and thank you all very much for attending this lecture. I'm very, very happy and very excited to be back after almost 40 years when I studied here, 1973, 1974. I remember very well how much I studied, and it was a great experience. It was a great experience. The last time I came to the LSE was in 2008. I came as Minister of Defense, and I gave a talk at the Shaw Library, and it was also very exciting, but I never imagined back in 1973, 74 that I would be back at the LSE as President of my country. So I'm very excited and very proud to be here in my former alma mater and with my colleagues, students of the LSE. You can always say, where did you go? I went to the LSE. When I came here, it was a different time. I had as one of my teachers, Peter Bauer, Lord Bauer, who then became one of the advisors of Margaret Thatcher, and Professor Mint. And I remember that at that time, one of the theories of economic development and one of the discussions was the theory of dependency, how the center and the periphery, and there was a big discussion in Latin America. There was an economist by the name of Raúl Prebisch, who was one of the most controversial economists, saying that there's a theory that all the countries that were in the periphery depended on the center, and that we had no way out of that situation. Then the world, at that time, and I studied here and then started working in the International Coffee Organization. At that time, the commodity agreements were in fashion, and the commodity agreements were the exact contrary to what free trade means. The commodity agreements, which were under the umbrella of the United Nations, said that the way to administer trade was through quotas and price ranges, and coffee was, at that time, the second most important product in world trade, and in my country was the most important product in our exports. We depended, in Colombia, almost 65% of our exports was coffee. So I stayed here in London working in the as a delegate from my country to the International Coffee Organization. Then, as always happens throughout history, the paradigm started to change. We went into the era of the free trade, very much influenced by Margaret Thatcher here in the UK, Ronald Reagan in the US, and what is today called the neoliberalism started to become the paradigm for the economist and the economic policy of the majority of the countries in the world. And later on came other theories emerged. One of them was the theory of the third way, which a former director of the LSE, Lord Giddens, he wrote very much about the third way. That said, no, it's not free. It's not a completely free trade. It's not completely the markets. Not completely the state. There's a middle of the way. He summed up the theory of the third way, saying you must allow the markets to work until it's possible, but then you must intervene with the state until it's necessary. That, in a way, could be applied to any situation. But it was a very the economic problems and the problems of development. And to answer one of those questions that are always in the mind of every government leader or any individual rights and collective rights. Or where do you draw the lines between peace and justice? These are eternal discussions that fluctuate from one extreme to the other according to the circumstances. Progress in the we are going today. And what I wanted to address to you is how, by applying this third way, and what is it that we have done in Colombia that we can say today, 2011, that we are a right. Just 10 years ago, we were about to be declared a failed state. A state that is a failed state, the academics define a failed state as a state where the government and the judicial system does not apply the law, where the government or the state does not control the territory. And we were on the verge of being declared failed state. And how and why did we manage to change the country, and why is it that we are today mentioned as one of the rising stars and one of the most effective democracies in the emerging world? Well, as I said, 10 years ago, we were almost a failed state, and we realized that security was, as the Romans used to say, the basis from which we can construct any of the public policies that we want to apply. If there is no security, the Romans used to say, and this is what we applied, then there's no way you can apply any other law with any degree of effectiveness. So my predecessor started what he called democratic security policy. Democratic had two meanings, very important, two meanings. Democratic was security for everybody, regardless if he was in pro-government or the opposition. But everybody who was under the umbrella of the rule of law should have a minimum security. But also, the democratic meant security following the rules dictated by our Constitution and our laws. That means respecting human rights. And the respect for human rights was fundamental in applying a security policy if we wanted, and this is applicable to any country, if we wanted the security policy to be legitimate. So we started, and he started applying this concept of democratic security with a high degree of success, because at the same time changes were made in our armed forces structure, in the efficiency of our police, our army, our air force, our navy, and we started to achieve one very important objective: regain the control of our territory. And this started to change immediately the mood of the country. And slowly we started to progress, and I will give you an example of the change that we've had in the last 8 years. 8 years ago, we have in Colombia 1,100 plus municipalities. Out of those almost 1,100 plus municipalities, 400 mayors of the municipalities were not able 8 years ago to work from their municipalities because of security reasons. Either the guerrilla groups or the paramilitaries controlled the territory, and they did not allow the elected officials to work from their respective towns. That was the situation 8 years ago. Today, every single mayor is working from its own municipality. This is simply to show you the change in terms of security that we have achieved, and that was the basis for starting the application of other policies that have been extremely successful in a very short amount of time. With the security issue not completely resolved, because we still have problems, but with enough progress being made, we then said the most important objective right now after security is economic and social objectives. If we want to make Colombia a sustainable democracy in the long run. And we must also modernize the state, applying a principle that I've defended all my life, called the principle of good government. Good government means something very simple: a government that is transparent, a government that is efficient, a government that is effective, and a government that has the principle of responsibility as one of its priorities. Responsibility means allowing the citizens to demand that the government gives them the information that they need, and responsibility is a principle that works two ways, from the government toward the citizens and the citizens toward the government. By applying that very simple concept of good government and establishing the third way policies of economic development and economic growth, we started then to build in the whole economic and social structure processes that started to give results. We decided that we need high economic growth in order to have the conditions necessary to be able to apply a very aggressive social policy. If there's no high economic growth, there's no resources available to apply good social policies. But as many of the students of economics have probably learned here, and as life has taught us, growth is not achieved by spontaneous generation. You have to help the economy grow by identifying those sources of growth. And we went through a very simple, common sense process in order to identify our own sources of growth. Each country has its own sources of growth, depending on what are our comparative advantages, what are our natural resources, what is needed, what type of population we have. In the case of Colombia, we we made a simple question. What is it that we need the most in order simply to achieve the same level of development of the countries that are similar to Colombia? And we identified immediately some sources of growth that we defined as locomotives of growth. Infrastructure, we were behind in infrastructure. We need a lot of investment in infrastructure, and so we identified that as one locomotive. Housing has always been, Colombia or anywhere, a tremendous source of growth because housing usually pools 30 or 31 or 32, in the case of Colombia, 32 industries. Cement industry, the steel industry, the different industry, they pull them, and so that was another source of growth, and we had a big deficit in the housing, and so we put in place a very ambitious objectives in terms of the number of housing that we're going to construct in the next 4 years. The third locomotive that we identified was the agribusiness and the rural areas. In today's world, one sees that the food is becoming scarce, and if China continues to grow, and India continues to grow, and Indonesia continues to grow, there's going to be a food crisis. Many say it has already started. You've seen the prices of the commodities go up and up, and that's because the demand is growing at a higher rate than the supply. And Colombia, fortunately, is one of the few countries in the world that has ample land to increase the production of food. And we haven't been able to do that because of the security reasons. For 40, 50 years, these were areas, more than 5 million hectares, that were controlled by the illegal armed groups. And so we then, with the security recovered, we have that amount of land to increase food production and stimulate the whole agribusiness and the production of food. The fourth locomotive that we identified was mining and oil. We are a very rich country in natural resources. We produce a lot of oil, we produce a lot of coal, we have a lot of mines, gold, there's a tremendous potential, and that is a locomotive that is already growing at around 12, 13, 14%. And there was a fifth locomotive that we identified as a sustainer for the other four in the long run, which is a word that is now very fashionable, which is innovation. Innovation as a source of growth. And why did we choose innovation as a source of growth? Because all of Latin America, for the last 20, 30, 40 years, have always been signaled as economies with a very low productivity. And when you study the countries that have had high sustainable growth for many years, you discover that the component of that growth, roughly 50%, has been higher productivity, or you can use another word, innovation. So we said, if we have low productivity, there's a tremendous potential to grow through simply innovating. And so we considered that the fifth locomotive. And we put in place a national development plan, which for the first time in many years in our history was not simply the sum of each ministry. The agricultural ministry has its plans, and then you have the mines ministry, and then you have the labor ministry. No, we set up a plan that was coordinated. What happens in communications and affects what happens in the education. What happens in the education affects what happens in the health sector. And so it's a comprehensive and integrated plan that we put in place and that we had approved in Congress. That in terms of the policies, of the economic policies that we put in place. At the same time, we did two other things which are very important. The social policies and the social objectives. We can grow at a high rate, but if we continue to have this very unequal distribution of the wealth of the country will not be sustainable. And if we continue to have such a high percentage of poor people, the country will not be sustainable. So we put in place some very focalized policies to address these two problems, especially the fight against poverty, the reduction of poverty, and the reduction of extreme poverty. To the extent that we have today identified families that we want to take out of extreme poverty, 350,000 families, we have them identified, where they live, what are their needs, where can we help them, where can we convince them to help themselves, and the objective is to graduate at least 350,000 families out of extreme poverty. Because that's another necessary condition for our sustainability in the long run. Now, all this, to do all this, you need something, a word which is today very much in need around the world, which is governability, the ability to govern, the ability to take decisions and to make reforms that are necessary. So what I did was, when I won the elections, and thank God I won them by a big margin, I called for a national government. Usually the coalitions of national government are made to win elections. In our case, I made it after I won, in order to be able to govern effectively. So I called in, I did something that Abraham Lincoln did when he won his election before the Civil War, was bring in your rivals into the cabinet. And I brought in my rivals, the people who had competed with me in the elections. I brought them into the cabinet, but not only because they were nice people, but because they had good ideas. And so I said to the head of the Liberal Party, you have a good proposal for employment. Okay, I will adopt your proposal because it's very similar to my objective, and you come into government. And I told the Conservative Party, you have a good proposal on X and Y. Come in and let's create a national government. And they all responded, most of them positively. 5 out of 6 parties said, we will come in. So that gave me the political base to be able to put in place those ideas on the economic scene and on the social scene. And to have major reforms approved that we had for many, many years thought that was what we needed to do, but that nobody had the political capacity to do it. So that allowed us in the last 15 months to approve reforms that nobody imagined that were possible 2, 3, 4 years ago. And that immediately brought a change in the way people started looking at Colombia. Here it is, a democracy that has gone through hell, because we have had 40, almost 50 years of violence, that we were considered the pariahs of the world. Suddenly, a democracy respecting the rights of the people, taking decisions which many times could be unpopular. For example, one of the reforms that we made was to introduce in our Constitution the concept of fiscal sustainability. That concept, we introduced it as a criteria to be taken into account in any decision that either the judicial power, the legislation, or the executive power takes. We must take into consideration the concept of fiscal sustainability. And at the same time, we had approved a law in Congress. We made a law that forces us, the government, the executive power, to behave within certain limits in our spending, in our expenditure. That by itself, those two reforms, immediately triggered a tremendous interest of the whole world of investors in our foreign debt, in our foreign bonds. Our spreads came down. We were granted investment grade by the credit agencies and said, this is a country that is performing responsibly. We had approved a very ambitious law on the distribution of our royalties in order to give the royalties to the more needed regions and the more needed people. The poor and the poor regions have a priority in the distribution of the royalties, and 10% of all the royalties will go into research and development, which is something that any country needs if they want to have a sustainable growth. And we approved a law which is being considered a very unique law worldwide that allows us to repair the victims of violence and to restitute the land to the peasants that were displaced by the violent groups. This is a law that's going to transform the rural structure of our country. And it's a law that will allow us to look at the future with much more optimism and with less reasons to keep fighting among each other. I say this is a law that will allow us to heal our wounds after 50 years of war. And it's already working. And you go to Colombia and you see the people are starting to heal their wounds. If you repair a victim, and I say this very respectfully but very graphically, you probably remember the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, always united in the Plaza of Buenos Aires, asking for justice. We want the victims to feel that they've been repaired and allow the victims to look at the future instead of looking in the past. And this is the whole sense of this law, which also changes the paradigm where we perform and we behave in order to get all these elements that I'm mentioning together and be able to take off in our development and in our progress. So this political governability plus the social policies plus the economic growth policies have been put together and are starting to work and are starting to have concrete results. For example, in the last year, we were the country in the region, and some people say in the world, in relative terms, that has created more jobs. 1,085,000 jobs we created in the last year, last 13 months. And most of them formal jobs, which is even better. While what you see in Europe, what you see in the US, what you see in many countries is how many jobs are we going to lose with this recession, with this. This has allowed us to construct for the first time in our history more than 270,000 new houses, popular houses for the poor. Investment is coming in at a rate that we had never seen in our history. And we're, in a way, breaking many of the records in many of the indicators. So the big challenge now is to see how we can make this sustainable in the future. One of the big challenges that we have has to do with what Lord Stern was mentioning. How, in today's world, can we make our growth sustainable and environmentally responsible? Being rich in mines and oil, but having Colombia is the richest country in the world in terms of biodiversity per square kilometer. Very, very rich country. How do you make those two compatible? And this is the type of dilemmas and challenges that we have right now. I told my environmental minister and the minister of mines get together and try to design state-of-the-art in terms of regulation to making mining and the preservation of the environment compatible. And those are the type of issues that we are now confronting on a daily basis. Problems of this sort emerges every day. We still have a conflict. We still have illegal groups. I've told them we will negotiate a peace process if you have goodwill to sit down and reach an agreement. Otherwise, we will continue to fight you militarily. And we've been very successful in fighting them militarily. Why have we been successful? Again, we changed the way people operated. I'll give you an anecdote of a specific event to illustrate what I'm trying to say. I was Minister of Defense before being President. I came as Minister of Defense into the military and said, the intelligence of each force, Army, Navy, Air Force, and police, they didn't speak to each other. And I said, you will have to speak to each other, and if I know that you have not spoken to each other and have not shared your information and your intelligence with the other forces, not only the Director of Intelligence, but the commander will go. I forced them to do something that they had never done. But I told them something else. I got the whole intelligence community in a room like this, and I said, you must start thinking differently, out of the closet. Think the unthinkable. And they said, think the unthinkable. Even if you think it's crazy, don't worry. If you think that it'll work, try it. So there were two ladies who, for the past 20 years, the only thing they did was hear the FARC, the guerrilla leaders, talk to each other. They were hearing for 20 years. And they said, well, the minister said, think the unthinkable. Why don't we propose what we have discussed so many times, that if we are able to technologically get into the communications, we can give orders to the commanders as if we were another commander. And they said, they went to a sergeant. The sergeant, this is a military hierarchy, he said, you're absolutely crazy. You go back to work and stop thinking. But they persevered, and they went to a captain. And the captain said, my God, this might work. And he went up and came to me. And they were very poor women, humble women, but very intelligent. And they said, we know exactly how they speak, what they do, we can give the orders. You probably remember this lady, Colombian lady, Ingrid Betancourt. She was kidnapped by the guerrillas and she spent 10 years with 3 Americans. Well, by listening to these two ladies and applying their their proposal, we liberated 15 kidnapped people in Colombia without firing one single shot. Those type of changes, that is what I call innovation. And through those changes, we've been very successful in fighting the terrorism. We now we export coffee, and we export how to fight drug traffickers and terrorists. This is a know-how that Colombia has. And it's true. This is true. But by applying this type of new thinking, of thinking always differently. So we're going in I think, in the correct direction. We're playing a role in the region. We, again, are regaining something that we had lost, faith in our future, faith in our, and feeling proud of being Colombians, and feeling proud of being part of our country and doing what we are doing. And this is like a virtuous circle. And so Colombia now is being signaled as a rising star. I was just last Friday having dinner with the president of Turkey. He is now coincidentally here in London also on an official visit, and we were discussing how these two countries, Turkey is another rising star. We are now part of a group called the CVETs. This is something that the intelligence unit of The Economist invented. CVETs is Colombia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Egypt, Turkey, and South Africa as the new BRICS. The BRIC was Brazil, Russia, India, and China. They were the countries that were the country with more future in the world. Well, after the BRIC come the CVETs. Colombia is the only country in Latin America, and we were saying with the Turkish president how things have changed, how things have changed in the last 10, 15 years. It's incredible. He and I, coincidentally, he was Prime Minister, I was Minister of Finance 10 years ago. We went through the worst crisis, economic crisis that our countries have had in the last century. We had to take very unpopular decisions. We were lectured by the European countries, by the US, by Japan. You must lower your debt. You must strengthen your financial systems. You must have fiscal discipline. You must lower inflation. And we did all that. You know? And now we are telling the Europeans, you must lower your debt. You must. But then we said, but we have to sustain this. There's many rules in the world, in life. The pendulum was one way or the other. The only thing certain you have is death and taxes, all those things. But one of the difficult things is sustainable growth in the long run. And we were discussing what is it that could make us at least this good times that we're living, how can we prolong it? How can we make it sustainable? And I think the answer, and this is simply the conclusion of this talk to you as students, is always think differently, think the unthinkable, and then you will continue to progress. Thank you very much.